Hi.
Good evening.
I'm Leslie Pilak. I'm the museum director at the Birmingham Museum. And I want to give you kudos for coming in person tonight. So quite a number of people online. So we have a very big crowd tonight, and this is an exciting night for us. Let me begin, though, by saying that the Birmingham Museum recognizes the Indigenous heritage of the land we occupy and honors the Indigenous peoples who have lived here in Oakland County. We invite you to join us in acknowledging the Anishinaabe people, the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, who occupied this land at the time of European settlement, and the Indigenous peoples who preceded them. And could I ask everyone online to please mute their speakers so it's not picked up in the Zoom? Thank you. So, welcome to the kickoff of the Birmingham Museum's 2026 lecture series for America's 250th anniversary this year. The museum is promoting our local history in our museum exhibit and throughout the city. In particular, we will be focusing on the Indigenous heritage of our area, anchoring our exhibit at the museum, which is about 2 blocks away, everyone. Anchoring our exhibit is an exploration of the traditional basket arts of the Anishinaabe, including 20th century and contemporary examples from our collection and the collections of the Leelanau Historical Society and the Michigan State University Museum. Our public hours are Tuesday through Saturday, 1 to 4 p.m. and by appointment. Our community has shown increasing interest in Native American culture. And so in addition to our exhibit, we want to bring local experts in Indigenous history to our monthly exhibit series in 2026. Before I go into more detail about tonight's program, I want to tell you what is coming in February, March, and especially April this year. In February, our one and only Donna Casaselli, who's in the back of the room, will be presenting on Indigenous and white settler encounters in Southern Oakland County. In March, Leslie Edwards is going to be presenting By Native Hands, Anishinaabe Basket Artists and the WPA. In April, we will be having renowned Odawa quillwork artist Yvonne Walker-Keshik and her daughter O'Damon Walker-Keshik for a 2-day program, The Living Art of Anishinaabe Quillwork, that will include a public presentation at the Southfield Public Library and a day-long workshop at the Birmingham Museum. So we're partnering with the Southfield Historical Society, and Darla Van Hoy happens to be here from the Southfield Historical Society. Hi, Darla. And that program, to find out more about it, you can contact us at the museum. It won't be coming up until April, but we already have a lot of interest. Okay, now for tonight's program. We're a small community museum, but we dream big. And thankfully, we have found some like-minded colleagues who want to lend us a hand. That's how we met tonight's presenter, Dr. Catherine Katie Kangany. What amazes me most about her is her extensive academic background. She has a doctorate from U of M in early American history and is a tenured associate professor at the University of Notre Dame. And her many interests, which include local archaeology, genealogy, and Indigenous history. She is also CEO of the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan, and somehow finds time to do deep dives into Detroit's, Detroit's early settlement and colonial history. And she also writes chapters for books in progress, as well as having a number of publications in the bag. For example, her 2014 book with the University of Chicago Press, Frontier Seaport, Detroit's Transformation into an Atlantic Entrepot. But wait, there's more. Her research on Detroit's colonial era moccasin industry, which brought us together on behalf of the Birmingham Museum, has been picked up by the Smithsonian and other cultural institutions. She's a worthy example of bridging the academic history with public history that I think we need as much of as we can get. And she's passionate about it all. I want to be her when I grow up.
We all do. Pushy.
Tonight, Dr. Kangany is going to discuss the indigenous peoples of the Oakland County area and how their local history has become a muddled mix of myth and reality over time. She'll explore the stories, oral histories, myths, and primary sources about the indigenous peoples living in what is now Oakland County to help us expand our understanding and distinguish fact from fiction. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kangany.
Okay, Leslie, thank you for that very warm welcome. I think that was the nicest intro I have ever had. It is a delight to be here. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, it is a delight to be here. Thank you, Leslie and Donna, for the invitation. Thank you to the Baldwin Public Library for hosting. Thank you for all my friends at JHSM and GWBHS who are here, and those friends I have yet to meet. I am delighted to be here. So we are talking tonight about Indigenous Oakland County, which is an anachronistic misnomer because, of course, Oakland County is not an Indigenous term. What we really mean is what life was like in what is now Oakland County when it was primarily an Indigenous space before about 1830. And that is not an easy assignment. There's a reason why historians' work on it is thin, and to understand why, we need first to talk about the discipline of history. In terms of method, historians go to sources or documents. And in this context, we're talking about documents created by white people, government officials, religious leaders, settler colonists. So history as a discipline can be quite problematic because of its reliance on white sources over indigenous sources like oral histories, creation stories, and material culture. The indigenous peoples who lived in Oakland County before 1830 handed down information orally. That means that unless there were white people around who were literate and had pen and paper at hand, there are no documents. So this is basically the situation for us before the 18 teens. And as time went on and settler colonists began claiming and occupying the land, then white narrators come into the picture. And occasionally there were white narrators who were interested in recording information from an indigenous perspective. Difficult to separate out the recorder from the settler colonist, by which I mean that Eurocentric mentality, those racist and discriminatory attitudes most white recorders in this period had. That makes extracting good information out of biased sources a real challenge. And that, of course, perpetuates the problem, right? Historians then use those problematic documents, and then often the history that we tell with them privileges white settlers and colonialism.
One moment. You are in presenter view. I can't see the slides correctly.
Oh, dear. Okay, one moment.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry about the technical difficulties there. So all to say, we're going to use white documents today, but we are adding to them oral histories, archaeology, maps, indigenous place names, and a host of other sources, including about Detroit, to understand what life was like here before white documents. We're going to be moving quickly. We're going to be covering a lot of geography, a lot of centuries, sometimes with a really broad brush. So Oakland County was formed in 1819, and we just established that the written historical record is extremely thin before 1819 because there weren't white recorders around to generate it. And white recorders weren't around to generate it because Oakland County, even in 1819, was Indian country. This is the big takeaway for us tonight. Unlike Detroit, Toledo, Saginaw, into which fur traders and colonists moved early and quickly, what became Oakland County remained indigenous space for far longer. So let's pull up a map and think for a minute about what's different about Oakland County compared with Detroit, Toledo, Saginaw. For example, you might notice that Oakland County is less proximate to big water, We've got lots of water around us, but we're considerably inland from the Great Lakes. And the 5 Great Lakes, 6 if you count Lake St. Clair, were the primary way indigenous peoples and early colonists moved around this region. Second, what this map doesn't show is that Oakland County was thickly forested, and where there weren't forests and lakes, there were wetlands and swamps. And you only have to look at this first survey done in June 1817 to see how inhospitable surveyors found the terrain to be even after the vernal ponds dried up. This is a section of Waterford Township showing all of the forested wetlands. So all of these factors slowed down white encroachment and preserved indigenous autonomy in what is now Oakland County. Detroit was founded by French explorer Antoine de la Mothe de Cadillac in 1701, and it was sited at the bend of the Detroit River, which of course isn't actually a river, it's a strait, and Detroit, Détroit in French, means of the strait. So the indigenous terms for this place, Wahweotanong in Anishinaabe-Mowin or Apanago in Wendat, are also rooted in that geography. Now, Cadillac envisioned Detroit as a joint French and indigenous settlement, and this might sound utopian, but actually it wasn't. He was shrewd enough to figure out that the French fort's best chance of success and the best way to beat the British at fur trading was to ally with local indigenous peoples. But the problem was, in 1701, there were no significant populations of indigenous peoples in Southeast Michigan. So Cadillac had to contact tribes in northern Michigan and Wisconsin. He contacted the Anishinaabe, or Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi, also an Ojibwa subgroup, the Mississauga. He contacted the Wendat. You may not know that word as Wyandot. The French called them Hurons. That comes from the French word for wild boar. So this was a pejorative reference to their bristly haircuts. Cadillac also contacted the Miamiaki and the Wisconsin tribes, the Saukes, the Meskwakis, and the Maskoutens, and he invited all of them to relocate to Detroit. So slowly over time, not without war breaking out in the process, they did. But it wasn't just one settlement as Cadillac envisioned. They each built their own forts at a safe distance from one another. So not a utopian city, but a collection of separated villages, where indigenous peoples outnumbered French colonists 4-1. We know from Cadillac's correspondence that very few people were in Oakland County in 1701 by virtue of how far away he had to look to find them. We also know that this state of things was the same 20 years earlier in 1680 when the French explorer La Salle came through southeastern Michigan. He didn't encounter substantial people either. But swamps and wetlands aside, this was and is a resource-rich place. We would predict, just on the availability of these resources, that the landscape would support life in vibrant numbers. So what was going on in the late 17th century? So we're going to answer that question the long way around, first by switching source bases to archaeology, and then traveling back in time many thousands of years. And by doing that, we find ample evidence of human habitation in what is now Oakland County. The indigenous peoples living here at the time were the forerunners of the modern day tribes. Modern day tribes call these earlier residents the ancestors. In Metro Detroit, the oldest established location affiliated with the ancestors is a small sandy ridge known as the Holcomb site. This is in Sterling Heights at 16 Mile and Dodge Park Road. This was found by an amateur archaeologist in the 1960s. It has yielded more than 7,000 projectile points, dated to 11,000 years ago. So these findings led University of Michigan researchers to conclude that it was a camp for hunters tracking caribou and perhaps mammoths and mastodons. So the landscape and the climate would have been unrecognizable to us. 11,000 years ago, this was tundra. Sites like Holcomb certainly would have existed in Oakland County, but so many have been destroyed, knowingly and unknowingly, by the construction of roads, railroads, and buildings, the plowing of fields, that we will never know all that was obliterated. Holcomb survived by chance, discovered only because that amateur archaeologist drove by it every day and wondered about it. Well, long after the Holcomb site's hunters dropped their projectile points, Michigan's first organized culture developed, and undoubtedly you are familiar with it. Called the Mound Builders, they constructed earthen forms that generally date from about 750 Common Era to 1200 Common Era, what's known as the Late Woodland Period. The mound builders are more recent ancestors to today's tribes, and they constructed two different types of earthen forms, conical burial grounds and circular earthwork enclosures. These forms would have served ceremonial, governmental, tactical, and/or communication functions, and most have been destroyed. As of 100 years ago, of those known mounds and enclosures, likely a minority of what originally had been built, only 5% still existed, and it's even less now. The best surviving local example is the burial mound at Fort Wayne in Detroit. Now, originally, there were probably 20 mounds in that complex. This was ground that was known in the colonial period as spring wells. Most of the spring wells mounds were destroyed by settler colonists, whether through looting, construction, or their livestock. One government official visiting Detroit exactly 200 years ago noted that only 3 of the spring wells mounds existed at that point, and they were in rough shape. He reported that, quote, "A principal cause of the mounds wasting away is the cattle go upon them to get into the cooler, fresher air, which blows upon them from the river, near the shore of which they are, and to get rid of the flies. The soil being light and sandy is kept stirred by them, and the rains wash it off." Well, despite being a sacred site, the surviving mound has been extensively excavated, including by archaeologists. And in the 1940s, after it was thoroughly looted, the Fort Wayne mound was at least partially rebuilt and later covered in sod. So how about mounds in Oakland County? Well, thanks to one of Michigan's early archaeologists, Wilbert B. Hinsdale, who cataloged them in 1931, we know of 8 mounds in the county, and you can see them here. A group of 4 mounds in the center of Groveland Township. So this is probably near the northeast corner of what's now the Holly Recreation Area. 1 mound in the eastern half of Orion Township. 3 mounds in Waterford, 2 near Macy Day Lake and 1 near Williams Lake. Hinsdale also noted 2 possible earthwork enclosures in east central Addison Township near Leonard, Michigan. Originally, again, there were many more. You will also know Mound Road, which runs north from Hamtramck through Sterling Heights up to just outside Romeo. In Hamtramck, Mound Road once marked the western boundary of a town called Prairie Mound. That town took its name from a nearby sandhill. You can see it at the top of the screen there. This was a 4-acre crescent-shaped dune that sat at the intersection of what's now Mound and 7 Mile roads, about where Lou's Coney Island is now, if you're familiar. So the settlers and archaeologists who dug up the hill agreed that it contained evidence of indigenous presence, but whether this formation was human-made or natural, it has been a matter of debate. It too is long gone. So historians used to say that sometime around 1200 Common Era, mound builders in Metro Detroit and elsewhere disappeared. Archaeologists used to use the euphemism rapidly depeopled. Sounds benign, right? Rapidly depeopled. They pointed to environmental stressors, intertribal war, other causes, but the gist was the mound builders were gone. Then the story went, there was a period of time when the land was empty before the next wave of indigenous peoples, the tribes we know of today, settled in Metro Detroit. This is what white science was saying. Indigenous peoples, on the other hand, were saying the opposite. The mound builders didn't disappear, they are our ancestors. And after centuries of disagreement, science caught up and now confirms what indigenous peoples had been saying all along. The various mound builder civilizations across North America did not die out, but rather merged and developed into the tribes we know today. But here's the caveat. For the Anishinaabeg, the Three Fires Confederacy, the largest of the indigenous groups in southeastern Michigan, the line between Michigan mound builders and them is not direct. Up until about 500 CE, the Anishinaabe were living in Wabanaki, the Dawnland. So this is present-day New England and Atlantic Canada. Like other tribes originating there, Abenaki, Passamaquoddy, Micmac, Penobscot, and others, the Anishinaabe are Algonquian speakers. They practiced similar life ways as other Wabanaki tribes. Their kinship ties were and are organized by clans. Most clans are represented by animals. Clans are the basis of almost everything: occupation, gathering knowledge, intertribal relations, and marriages. You have to marry outside your clan. Like the other tribes of the Dawnland, the Anishinaabe practiced interplanting, so that farming technique of growing beans, corn, and squash all together for both agricultural and nutritional benefits. This was supplemented with berries, groundnuts, maple sugar, fish, and game. They practiced what ethnogeographers call seasonal transhumance, meaning they moved around over the course of a year, cycling between living in larger villages in the summer when resources were plentiful and smaller winter camps when resources were scarce. So sometime around 500 CE, the Anishinaabe began a long, slow migration from the Dawnland, Wabanaki, to the Great Lakes, Anishinaabe, and that would take 500 or 600 years. This migration was part of a series of events foretold by 7 prophets concerning 7 different periods of time. The first prophecy urged the Anishinaabe to begin heading west from Wabanaki into what is now Montreal, following a sacred shell. Later prophecies gave more specific information as they moved west. The third prophecy is usually understood to relate to Lake St. Clair and Detroit, a place where, as the prophecy put it, the food grows on the water. Well, this food was manoomin, or wild rice. It's sometimes called false rice because it's actually the seed of an aquatic grass. Manoomin once grew in abundance along the shores of the interior lakes, and it holds spiritual significance for the Anishinaabe. Today, there's a Michigan Wild Rice Initiative, which is a collaboration between leaders of Michigan's 12 federally recognized tribes and several state agencies, and they restore wild rice beds, including along the Detroit River. Amazingly, Southeast Michigan has 2 remaining original wild rice beds, and both are in Oakland County. At Independence Oaks on Crooked Lake in Clarkston, and at Rose Oaks County Park on the aptly named Wild Rice Pond. So it's unclear what other tribes were here when the Anishinaabe arrived in 900 or 1000 CE, in part because the sources are thin or they're not tied to modern notions of time, and also in part because, just like the Anishinaabe, these other tribes also practiced seasonal transhumance, and they moved around over the course of a year. For most, if not all, of these other tribes, southeastern Michigan was on the fringes of their ranges. In the 17th century, we know there were other Algonquian speakers in southeast Michigan, including Mascoutins and the Miami Yaqui. There were also Haudenosaunee speakers here, including the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, the Wendat, the French called them the Hurons, and the Attawandaron, the French called them the neutrals, because they tried not to take sides in conflicts with other Haudenosaunee speakers, and that strategy only worked for them up until about the year 1600. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So, like the Anishinaabe, many of the tribes I just mentioned originated east of the Great Lakes and migrated, but not because of internal motivators like prophecies, but because of external pressures, in a word, colonialism. The reason that Cadillac and LaSalle could not find many indigenous people here in the late 17th century was because of the catastrophic changes that European powers had wrought on the Americas. Even before European people arrived in the Great Lakes, and it's earlier than you might think. French explorer Etienne Poulet came through in 1610 to 1615. But even before European people made it here, their diseases made it here, hurtling along indigenous trade routes and ravaging indigenous communities, which had little immunity to these new pathogens. We all got a tiny glimpse on a much different scale of how that happened with COVID-19, which was very contagious, very quickly became a mass casualty disease. So indigenous communities in the Great Lakes and elsewhere were decimated at the beginning of colonialism in a period of time historians call contact. Beginning with Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean in 1492, smallpox, diphtheria, cholera, plague, chickenpox, measles, scarlet fever, influenza, typhus, malaria, rhinovirus, and other European diseases swarmed through the Americas, wiping out 25%, 50%, sometimes 90 or 95% of the indigenous communities they encountered. The coasts and central Mexico, where there was a density of indigenous peoples and Europeans, were especially hard hit. By 1700, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, which probably had constituted upwards of 100 million people in 1492, that's more than Europe, they had lost 55 million people. This devastation is sometimes called the Great Dying. Did the Great Dying happen in Oakland County? Certainly, happened everywhere. We don't and we won't know the numbers with any precision, but losses of 25 to 50% seem realistic. It wasn't just the number of deaths, although that was catastrophic. It was also the other losses that accompanied them, of knowledge, of stories, of history, of stability, of leadership. So together, these losses made indigenous communities even more vulnerable to Europeans and what they offered. Trade goods, horses, guns and ammunition, alcohol. Once Europeans hooked you on their stuff, it was hard to break free and hard to go back. The Eastern tribes' growing dependence on Europeans produced yet another catastrophe for Eastern North America, and that is the Beaver Wars. Dutch, French, and later British colonizers poured into New York, the St. Lawrence River Valley in eastern Canada, the Great Lakes, beginning in the early 17th century, and they were there to exploit any resource they deemed valuable: people, land, timber, fish, and beaver skins. Well, by the late Middle Ages, Western Europe had exhausted its supply of fur-bearing animals, and these were used for hats and gloves and other articles. And so they turned their attentions east to Russia. When the Russian supply was depleted by about 1600, they turned their attentions to North America. And where did beavers live in North America? Well, right here. So European colonizers understood that getting a hold of a sufficient supply of beaver skins to meet European demand required indigenous cooperation. Cooperation turned into alliances, alliances turned into competition. On one side were the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, based out of New York, allied with the Dutch and later the British. On the other side was basically everybody else, the Anishinaabeg, all the other Algonquian speakers, plus the rest of the Haudenosaunee speakers, the Wendots and the Neutrals, who were all allied with the French. The competition for beaver regularly erupted into war, starting in 1609, and the Haudenosaunee-Dutch-British alliance proved incredibly aggressive and well supplied. The Haudenosaunee then attacked all of their long-standing enemies, defeating them one by one. They destroyed the Wendots and their homeland, Wendake in Quebec and Ontario, from 1648 to 1650. They destroyed the Neutrals in 1651. In 1689, they destroyed a sizable Miami settlement in Ohio. And with each win, the vanquished tribes' homelands were annexed to Iroquois, expanding Haudenosaunee territory further and further west. By 1670, it included Michigan. By 1680, Indiana and Illinois. The survivors of the Anishinaabe-Wendat Neutral French Alliance fled west, many to Wisconsin, so that by 1680, Oakland County was a no man's land, somewhat controlled by the Haudenosaunee, but mostly emptied of its people. As French explorer La Salle noted that year, quote, "The Indians do not hunt in this region, which is debatable, contested ground, between 5 or 6 nations who are at war, and being afraid of each other, do not venture into these parts except to surprise each other, and always with the greatest precaution and all possible secrecy." Well, things might have remained this way, but for the growing strength of the British colonies on the eastern seaboard. By the final years of the 17th century, the Haudenosaunee saw the British colonies as more of a threat than the French, and they realized that making peace with the French could help check Britain's growing power. And so in 1701 came the Great Peace of Montreal, which formally ended the Beaver Wars and the hostilities between the French Indigenous Alliance and the Haudenosaunee. So note that the British are not involved in this peace. Two of the agreement's provisions are especially important to us. First, the tribes who had been forced west by the fighting would be allowed to return to their homelands. And second, the French would be permitted to establish a fort at Detroit. So now we see that the Anishinaabe and the Wendat didn't move to Detroit after 1701. They returned home. For all that Cadillac tried to understand the complex relationships between area Indigenous peoples, especially in the crucible of colonization, he made an epic, devastating blunder at the end of his time at Detroit. Before he was removed in 1710, he had invited the Meskwaki, Mascoutin, Kickapoo, and Sauk tribes, who were currently living in Wisconsin, also refugees from the Haudenosaunee, to come back east and establish a village at Detroit. In theory, this seemed like a great idea, right? The Wisconsin tribes, they controlled the Fox River system. That was the gateway for the French to then trade directly with the powerful Lakota and Dakota tribes in Minnesota and beyond. So Cadillac reasoned, more Indigenous allies for the French, fewer for the British, and the French Empire could expand into Minnesota. But the Meskwaki, Sauks, and Mascoutins had no interest in being controlled by the French. They wanted to dominate at Detroit, and they wanted to prevent the French from dealing directly with the Lakota and the Dakota. So in 1711, a large group of Meskwaki, Sauks, and Mascoutins, larger than the French and Wendat at Detroit combined, arrived at Detroit to set up their own village just west of the fort and west of the Wendat settlement. So you see in red there, the new Meskwaki village, which is just plunked down right in the middle of it all. So in addition to underestimating the Wisconsin tribe's own motivations, Cadillac had failed to appreciate the long-standing animosity between the Anishinaabe and the Wisconsin tribes. His successor was very wary of upsetting Detroit's delicate balance. He was not happy about this development at all. So he asked an Odawa chief named Saguima and a Potawatomi chief named Makasabi to bring their forces from northern Michigan down to Detroit to keep the Wisconsin tribe's numbers in check. So in the spring of 1712, 600 Anishinaabe men arrived in Detroit, and relations soon devolved into violence. In the course of 3 weeks, the combined Allied forces slaughtered 1,000 Meskwaki, Sauk, and Mascoutin men, women, and children. 1,000 survivors were sent into slavery. Now, long before colonialism, many tribes in North America, including the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, practiced slavery. Now, this was not Atlantic chattel slavery. This is a much older form of slavery, and it was rooted in taking captives from enemy tribes or colonial powers during times of war. So this is war captive slavery. Sometimes this slavery was temporary. Captives might be ransomed for money or for goods. Sometimes, especially among the Haudenosaunee, captives were ritually tortured and killed to bring about catharsis for the tribe. Sometimes captivity was more permanent. Slaves could be used to rebuild the tribe, replacing individuals who had died. In these cases, captives underwent ritual adoption, and over time, their status might improve. So in this indigenous form of slavery, it was not race-based and it was not heritable. You did not pass down your captivity to your children. Now, when the French arrived in the Great Lakes in the early 17th century, they were practicing Atlantic chattel slavery, taking Africans into permanent, heritable, race-based bondage. And the intersection of these two forms of slavery met in places like Detroit and in instances like the Fox or Meskwaki Wars. Some of the 1,000 men, Meskwaki men, women, and children who were taken into slavery were passed on to the Illini living in Illinois. And in this instance, we can imagine we're talking about war captive slavery. But others were sold to the French at Detroit, and their status would have been more akin to chattel slaves. So here are the baptismal records For two young Meskwaki children, they've been given French names. You see Marie-Louise, who's age 5, and Francois, who's age 6, who have been sold to French households. All to say that Indigenous peoples in Oakland County, just like at Detroit or Michilimackinac or New York or Wisconsin, would have practiced slavery here, and captives would have passed through Oakland County on their forced migrations elsewhere. Now, through its system of rivers and lakes and trails, Oakland County was a very well-connected place. 4 major trails passed through it. The Saginaw Trail, which connected Detroit with Saginaw, the Shiawassee Trail, which is really the western branch of the Saginaw Trail, the Grand River Trail that leads to Lake Michigan, and the Clinton River Trail, which veers north into the Thumb region. In addition to all these, early white settlers noted towpaths to individual lakes, and there would have been many more than you see represented on this map. Some of the early surveyors were very fastidious about marking trails, and others were not. So you see, we sort of have to fill in the lines, but we can imagine much more than even just these. Note here the trails all the way around Orchard Lake. In the center of Orchard Lake sits the nearly 40-acre Apple Island, perhaps the best studied Indigenous site in Oakland County. The island and the lake take their names from the 20 to 30 apple trees growing on the island's high ground when white surveyors first noted them in 1824. The trees and their cultivators are a bit of a mystery. Apples are a colonial fruit. The French colonists brought them to North America in the 16th and 17th centuries. So it's possible that these are true apple trees supplied by the French, likely from Detroit. Of course, there don't seem to have been French colonists in Oakland County with regularity, and we know French-owned apple trees tended to be tended. So interestingly, most of the 19th century references to Apple Island's fruit trees call them an Indian orchard, which in this period meant an old orchard of ungrafted apple trees, the time of planting being unknown. So this term doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Indigenous peoples. Rather, it's clarifying that these are not cultivars that were producing a uniform fruit. Rather, these were trees that began from seeds or seedlings, and they would then produce a variety of apples depending on what other apple trees the pollinators were visiting. And with ungrafted apple trees like these, the fruit was often fit only for cider. But let's suppose that the people cultivating apple trees on Apple Island were native. Well, the Anishinaabe are not known for having cultivated apples. The Haudenosaunee did. There are references to Iroquois orchards in New York. But as Oakland County was only briefly on the fringes of Iroquois, it seems sort of a stretch to imagine Haudenosaunee cultivators on Apple Island, but it's possible. White settlers claimed that the indigenous name for Apple Island was Minasagorning, which was said to mean place of the apples. Now, the Anishinaabe word for apples is Mishimanog, which does not sound close to Minasagorning. So historian Charles Martinez observed that the word for wild apples, the fruit of the hawthorn tree, known as thorn apples or haws, this is a small tart fruit known to have been eaten by indigenous peoples. That word is minensag, right? Minensag, Minasagorning, somewhat close. The gorning part at the end is not right at all. Those are not sounds in Anishinaabe, but land or ground, which is akaming, or across the lake, agaming, sound close. So maybe originally Apple Island was place of the haws. But eventually, whether in 1824 or afterward, we know Eurasian apples were on the island because here's a photo of one from the 1920s. Well, a century earlier, the indigenous caretakers of Apple Island's fruit trees lived on the northeast shore of the lake. On the left here, you see Samuel Carpenter's 1817 survey. So see the ground in red marked Indian huts. Here's an 1826 description of the village, quote, good bark huts, by which he means wigwams, an old burial ground placed near the dwellings, ears of corn mottled with a diversity of colors, and dried fish were suspended within and around the huts. The little furniture they possess is mostly of their own fabrication. Blankets spread out on the ground or on wooden platforms constitute their beds. Ornamented dresses and implements of war and hunting were displayed. The females are comfortably clad and some much decorated with silver. So note the references here to blankets, dresses, war and hunting implements, and silver. These would have been manufactured by whites for indigenous consumers. This cross-cultural material culture aligns with Apple Island's archaeological record, which includes kaolin pipe stems, a Venetian or Dutch glass bead, French and British gunflints, a French uniform button, reworked scrap metal from a copper kettle, tinkle cones made from reworked copper or brass, and a silver cross. We don't know how these items came to be on the island or how many hands they passed through before they got there, but we do know that they were all made by Europeans, and with the exception of the uniform button, they were all made specifically for indigenous consumers. And in two cases, the reworked metal and the tinkle cones, those were originally part of European-made pots or brass kettles, and they were repurposed by native artisans into items of personal adornment. The silver cross, which you see on the lower right there, suggests contact with French Catholic priests, and archaeologist David Brose has noted that the Apple Island cross appears identical to several that were plundered from an 18th century Odawa cemetery along the Saginaw River. So that captures, I think, something of the ties between indigenous Oakland County and Saginaw. Well, given the nearby trail that linked Oakland County with Saginaw and Detroit, many non-native inhabitants have claimed Apple Island was home to Odawa chief Pontiac, who waged a 6-month siege against the British at Detroit in 1763 as a bid to induce the French to return and reclaim it. Some say Pontiac was born on Apple Island, some say he retired there after his siege ended. It's possible he passed through it. He was migratory, as were his people, but if he did pass through, it was short-lived. We can see here from the primary source record that he spent a lot of his time at Detroit, also in Toledo and in the Illinois country, where he was murdered and probably hastily buried. So it's much more likely that the Pontiac Association for Apple Island comes from Pontiac, the city, which was founded in 1818 as part of federal plans to claim and then control indigenous Oakland County. One indigenous person who may have been born on Apple Island was Okemos, an Ojibwe chief closely affiliated with the Saginaw Chippewa tribe, and likely he was born in the 1770s. Tradition has put his place of birth in Bancroft, Michigan, in Shiawassee County along the Shiawassee River. But in 1856, Okemos was deposed for a court case, and when he was asked about his place of birth, he replied, quote, "I was born in Michigan near Pontiac on an island in a lake." The most compelling visual evidence for indigenous Oakland County comes from its twilight, when the land rapidly was becoming a predominantly white space. In 1831, French magistrates Alexis de Tocqueville and Gustave de Beaumont were deeply worried about France's future after 2 revolutions in 50 years. They journeyed to the United States to study the American democratic experiment, producing pages and pages of notes and commentary and analysis and drawings, including of their journey from Detroit to
You guys
Saginaw.
should just go to bed. I feel like
Here we find Ojibwa bands moving between temporary encampments, mostly steering clear of settlers in the line of settlement. Beaumont and Tocqueville read tension and wariness into most of the cross-cultural interactions they witnessed, although they never encountered violence. The exception to the suspicion that they sensed was Oliver Williams, who had settled on Silver Lake in Waterford. Williams insisted that he preferred the company of indigenous people and trusted them over whites. As Leslie Pilak has shown, this insistence overwhelmingly was due to the personal relationship that he cultivated with Kishkako, chief of the Saginaw Chippewa tribe, who had known early and firsthand what American settlement would mean for his people, and he treated those around him with anger and sometimes brutality. So in his dealings with Kishkako, Williams brought back the old diplomatic practice of gift giving. a practice that the French regime had employed, the British regime had discontinued, and the American regime reserved for formal treaties. So through gifts, Williams found a way to honor the tribe, give special recognition to Kishkako, and further his own land holding interests. Well, like Williams, Tocqueville and Beaumont came to empathize with the Anishinaabeg, including their guide, who you see on the left and also on the larger image on the left side of that one. His name was Sagan Coisco, and he was accompanied by a 12-year-old boy. The four of them met up north of Grand Blanc, traveled to Saginaw together. As Beaumont put it, the indigenous, quote, I saw en route to Saginaw live peacefully in their forests. Everyone who has relations with them praises their honesty, sincerity, and generosity. Of course, Europeans who do business with them enjoy one great advantage, that of cheating them repeatedly. Tocqueville summed up the frontier experience thus, quote, you feel only quiet admiration, a gentle, melancholy emotion, and a vague distrust for civilized life. It pains you to think that soon this delightful solitude will have been utterly transformed. In 1931, archaeologist Wilbert B. Hinsdale compiled a map of 15 known indigenous villages in Oakland County, and they're marked here in pink. About most of them, we know very little. The two at the lower right in Southfield, Tonquish's Village and Seguinsuan's Village, became Potawatomi reservations with the 1807 Treaty of Detroit. This is when the Anishinaabeg and the Wendat formally ceded southeastern Michigan to the United States. These reservations did not last long. The Potawatomi were forced to cede them 20 years later for a reservation south of Kalamazoo. The U.S. took back the Kalamazoo land in 1833 for a reservation in Kansas, then took back that land for Oklahoma. This was the era of Indian removal, the federal government's policy of land grabbing and ethnic cleansing through treaties, forced displacements, and death marches. This is how Michigan achieved statehood, by taking native lands and clearing out native peoples. The 1836 Treaty of Washington, you see it here in the cornflower blue, this forced the Ojibwa and the Odawa tribes to cede 14 million acres. This is 40% of the lower and upper peninsulas, and this is what established Michigan's official boundaries for statehood in 1837. By then, all of those Oakland County villages were gone. So what has happened to Oakland County's indigenous? Well, some fled west or north ahead of those forced removals. Some waited for eviction and then were marched west. Many of them died on the way. Some hid from eviction and returned home. Some fought to remain on Michigan's reservations. There are 12 today. Some settled in Ontario. Some left or were taken off of reservations and endured forced acculturation and assimilation, including at abusive boarding schools, where by 1926, 82% of Indigenous children were sent. In short, Indigenous people are still here, and they're still fighting to protect and reclaim their homelands, to repatriate stolen grave goods and human remains, to reintroduce sustainable agricultural and landscape management techniques, and to revive cultural practices and languages. As of 2020, there were 30,000 in Metro Detroit. In Okanagan, Wahweotanong, and Detroit, recent Indigenous activism has been vibrant and powerful. Last April, Detroit City Council transferred ownership of the Fort Wayne burial mound to the Nottawasepi Huron Band of the Potawatomi. It is a fitting return. When Cadillac asked Indigenous peoples to join with the French at Detroit, the Potawatomis agreed, and they established a village in 1704. And by 1732, it was relocated to just down the riverbank from that mound. So it's a very fitting return. There are other strides. These are imperfect, but they are strides. The city is now making it easier for Indigenous people to buy property in the city, offering a 50% discount on land bank purchases. As of last month, Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel launched a criminal investigation into Michigan's 8 Native American boarding schools and orphanages, a development that comes after a century or more of Indigenous calls for action, including by Deb Haaland, an enrolled member of the Laguna Pueblo, who was then serving as U.S. Secretary of the Interior. Alongside activism, there have been recent inspiring milestone celebrations of culture. Last October, on Indigenous Peoples Day, Detroit held its first powwow in 30 years. And now through early April, the DIA is showcasing its first major Indigenous art exhibition, also in 30 years, called Contemporary Anishinaabe Art, a Continuation. It showcases artists from Michigan and beyond, and it features film and graphic design alongside traditional arts like beadwork and basketry. And speaking of basketry, Anishinaabe basketry is also on display right now in a brand new exhibit at the Birmingham Museum, along with really exciting companion programming for the spring, including a quilling workshop. So all to say that Indigenous Oakland County did not end in 1837. It is all around us. Thank you. Working. There we go. Okay. Ooh, okay, that was 11,000 years in 45 minutes. Goodness. Okay, we have time for questions if you have any. And I'll also say that we have some fabulous experts in the room who can talk with more specificity about some of the sites in Oakland County that we mentioned. So the floor is open. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yes, you have a book on this, all this information we have, there's so much you can't really take it in, is there any books you can refer us to?
So the question was, do I have a book? Not yet, but it's coming. It's coming. I'm working on it. Yes. Yeah, thank you. Anything else? Yeah.
The preservation of the different languages, different indigenous languages, how many are there?
What about the preservation of indigenous languages? An innumerable number. Anishinaabe, Mowin, and the Haudenosaunee and Wendat languages are both being revitalized right now. The deep irony of this process is that often it is reliant on white sources, French priests' dictionaries and other things to bring that language back. So the irony is that it was both the source of the destruction and also the source of helping revitalize. So these languages very much are coming back. Other things, yes.
And this Apple Island, is it fully, has it been excavated to find things, or do they still go out there? Is there anything out there now?
Has Apple Island been excavated? Yes, it has, several times, at least twice by Cranbrook, at least once or twice by David Brose, who was affiliated, I think, with Western Michigan at the time. And I can imagine that there might be plans for future digs in the years to come. In 2019, Apple Island was added to the National Historic Register, which is great, not for its indigenous content, because that would have been more difficult to prove, and the idea was to get it on the register. But there's a lot still that needs to be appreciated about Apple Island. I will say that the Greater West Bloomfield Historical Society, which operates the Orchard Lake Museum, has some of the objects, and maybe all of the objects that were recovered from Apple Island. So that's a great place to go to learn more about the archaeology. Leslie.
I'm on the Michigan Historical Commission, and we just reviewed a marker that will be placed down at the Sacred Mound site. The marker text was prepared with input from the tribe, so it reflects the tribal needs and sacredness of the site. And I just wanted to point out that I don't know when it will actually be erected, but there will be a Anishinaabe-centric marker there in the future.
So Leslie was just mentioning, for those of you on Zoom, that there's a forthcoming updated marker that will be placed at the Fort Wayne Burial Mound, which is great. The existing signage is not sufficient. There's also a small plaque that's half empty. If you look at the text, the whole bottom half of the sign is blank. It's horrible. So this is very good news that an Anishinaabe centric marker will be placed there. Yes.
Are there plans for another powwow?
Are there plans for another powwow? Yes, the Detroit councilwoman who was behind getting this one would like to see tradition again. So yes, hopefully next spring, hopefully this spring. Yes.
So in the late 1920s, our local paper, the Birmingham Eccentric, published a story that claimed that there was a Chippewa village where our Greenwood Cemetery was located. Is this even plausible based on what you know?
So I'm gonna defer on that question about a possible village in Birmingham to Leslie and Donna. It's not what I've seen on Hinsdale's atlas. Leslie, do you want to say more?
That is a tradition that was handed down, that came from someone who claimed to have heard it from 2 or 3 other sources, one of which was an old fur trader. That there was a massacre that occurred along the Rouge River there. And the story is that the fur traders saw the car. We have never been able to verify any of that. In fact, the time period that probably occurred during, it may have actually referred to the Saginaw Chippewa, the Chippewa people who did attack the Sauk in the Saginaw Valley and took over Saginaw Valley. But in Birmingham, I don't believe there was an established village there. There might have been a campsite, but I think it's really has not been verified. So I don't trust it that way.
Okay, so for those of you on Zoom, seems to be a community story that has a vibrant and long-standing tradition, but no evidence of it having been historically accurate. Yes, Neil.
It's just getting out ahead. Perhaps it explains why it's the Rouge River.
What red? What?
So speculation about the name of the Rouge River, Rouge being French for red, is that a reference to blood?
No, because it was named from Detroit. It was not named up in Birmingham.
Anything else? Yes, sir.
Active digs at this time?
Are there any active digs at this time? You mean anywhere in Oakland County?
Yeah.
Not that I am aware of, what's the one guy?
I'm just saying that when you show the amateur guy.
Oh, yeah, the guy from the 60s, right, who's driving by and was like, hey, what's that Sandy Hill? Yeah, let me just get my spade and see what's in there. Yeah, not that I have heard, but obviously, you know, this is a history that's all around us, so we have to assume it's still all around us. Yes.
Dr. Kagandy,
Oh, yes.
I don't know if you can see the chat, Dr. Kagandy, but there's a few questions in the chat.
Oh, great. If you could read them to me, that would be lovely, because
I would be more than happy to. If you want to take that other question you were about to ask in the room, and then I will get to the questions and I'll be happy to ask them to you.
Okay, thank you. After you.
There was a lot of talk of numbers changing, but I didn't get a sense of, like, say, 19th century, how much indigenous population there was. Like, do we have any sense? Is it?
So the numbers that I have seen, and these are seasonal encampments. These are small villages, 200 here, 150 here, and that's even true in the 18th century at Detroit. So we're not talking about a massive situation like Mexico City or, you know, even St. Louis. So this would have been, because they're so migratory, right? They're all over the place all at once. Yeah. So, but very hard to gauge numbers. Okay, ready when you are for Zoom questions.
Okay, I have a 2-part question for you. One is from Nadav Pace Green Apple. What do we know about life in the reservation villages that existed for that short period in Oakland County, e.g. Southfield? And then a follow-up to that is also RE, the mound builders. If I haven't messed up the timeline, what do we know about their relationship to the Hopewell Society that built, and I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it, CAHOKIA, and other sites in Southwest Ohio?
Okay, these are great questions, Nadav. So Hopewell and the Michigan Mound Builders and a whole host of other mound building civilizations across North America are linked to each other, but they are distinct cultures. So the pottery and the projectile points, even the styles of the mounds differ between all of these various cultures. And they did all kind of mix and mingle together, which gives rise to the tribes today. On the question of Southfield's reservations, do we have any experts in the room? Yeah, we sure do. Okay, go for it.
And you should know we can hear them on the mic, so you don't have to repeat.
Okay,
Dr.
thank
Kingany.
you.
The Southfield Historical Society has a town hall museum. We did a permanent exhibit on the Potawatomi, and it addresses a lot of those issues that they're asking about. What was life like in a wigwam on where did they go? Our two reservations, one was between Inkster Road and Inkster and Telegraph, no, because we need to go east. Between Inkster and Telegraph section, Inkster and Beach Road and 8 and 10 Mile Road. And that's in southwest Southfield. And it was sections 30 and 31. The other one was 8 and 9, sections 8 and 9, north off of 12 Mile between Gloucester and then 2 miles to the west. But again, we knew that they were migratory. There were Potawatomi in Farmington. They went as far as Livonia. There's Tonquish Creek in Livonia. What people need to do is to go visit the Zebewing Center in Mount Pleasant. It is a fabulous museum. It's across the street from Soaring Eagle. It's operated by the Saginaw Chippewa Band. And that would be a really great place to go. Or we will soon have dates to have our museum open, and they can come and see what we have.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll have two more questions. I think you pretty much answered this question, but I'll just state it. So Randy Schwartz asked, I wasn't clear on your conclusion about the mound builders. Where were they the direct answers of any historical tribes in Michigan or not? I think you kind of answered that, but if you just want to touch on it one more time.
Sure. I'm not direct to the Anishinaabe, certainly, because they were in Wabanaki at the time. We don't know who else was here exactly in 900 or 1000 CE, so it's hard to say. And all of these cultures kind of mixed and mingled anyway, so it is something that I think is impossible to tease out. But they are considered the ancestors of today's tribes.
And then Elliot Girdle, he actually put the link in for the DIA exhibit. So anyone who wants to capture information about that can grab that link and go ahead and open that up. And then one more question from me, which I didn't pose into the chat, but this was absolutely wonderful. I love seeing you with your other hat on. But I was wondering, do you have any other upcoming lectures that we might be able to catch that you're going to be giving anytime soon?
Yes, on Sunday at the Warren Public Library. Warren Public Library is hosting the Smithsonian Traveling Exhibit, Americans in the Holocaust. Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock, I and a few scholars of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust are talking about anti-Semitism in Michigan. We're going to cover Henry Ford, Father Coughlin, the Black Legion, which was a breakaway movement of the KKK, the lovely people, the German American Bund, all that stuff. So Warren Public Library, 2 o'clock on Sunday.
Can that be,
Do we need to register?
can that be someplace where I can, like, can it be on the library's site or?
So you can go to Jewish Historical Society's
Yeah.
website, jhsmichigan.org, which will give you information about how to register. It's free. The library opens at 1. You can go through the exhibit first, and then the panel starts at 2. Just have to register is all.
And if you have problem registering through JHSM, you can go to the Warren Civic Library site and register there.
Yeah, thank you.
I also put the link into the chat, and it's the same registration page through the library as well as JHSM site.
Thank you. Okay. Woo! Thank you very much. This was fun.
Just one more quick comment. I want to thank all of you for being here in person. I want to thank everybody online. Great result, a lot of interest in our Indigenous history. And, you know, we want to encourage you to keep exploring that. There are a lot of ways you can find out more about it. It's popping up all over. Our lecture series is a monthly series. We will be promoting it on our website. The entire series description is not there yet, but it will be at the Birmingham Museum. Or you can always call the museum and say, I don't see it. What's going on? Because we want to get the word out. Thank you, Dr. Kankany.